hardly here. So let me continue to hold, and we'll let someone else go.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Ms. Scanlon.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Mr. Raskin, I too am very excited by this legislation to see a bill that's going to deal with the issues that my constituents are most concerned about: medical costs, the inflationary impact of the deficit, which went way up after the reconciliation bill passed by the Republicans in 2017, the ability for Congress to finally close some of these tax loopholes that are allowing the wealthiest among us and corporations to not pay their fair share, and to finally take substantive action on the climate issues, which are posing an existential threat to our nation and our children. So I'm very excited about all of the provisions in this bill. Mr. Pallone, today I had occasion to meet with some constituents, some members of the Delta sorority. We're doing some voter registration at a local health clinic, and one of the Deltas was telling me she's 89. Her husband is 86, I believe, and they had to fill some prescriptions, 4 prescriptions yesterday, and they had to pay $200 out of pocket, which was a lot for them. They're going to have to pay that again before the end of the month. So how is this bill going to help folks like my constituents, older Americans who are on Medicare and need to maintain their prescriptions in order to stay healthy?
Well, I don't know how much detail you want, but I mean, basically what it says is that the Secretary of Health and Human Services is required to negotiate drug prices on the highest cost single source drugs in Medicare that have been on the market for a long time. And it establishes the maximum price the Secretary can negotiate based on whether or not these are the drugs that have cost the most and whether prices have gone up the most. And so I do believe the most important part of this is that once we start negotiating prices for drugs, and we will go after the ones that are, have the biggest price increases, they'll see the actual prices, come down significantly, because we pay a lot more for these drugs in the United States than they do in all these other countries, whatever, Japan, France, Australia, than they do in all of of the other developed countries. But also this cap on Medicare Part D out-of-pocket drug spending at $2,000 a year is significant. A lot of people say, oh, $2,000 a year, but they don't realize that many seniors pay a lot more, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year out of pocket. And so that's significant. And then it requires the drug manufacturers to pay a rebate to Medicare if they increase their prices faster than the rate of inflation. And they have been doing that significantly, particularly during this COVID period. So I think that although the rebate is to the government, they're not going to want to pay a rebate to the government. So that's going to be a factor. I mean, those are the 3 most important things, other than that, if they're taking insulin, the $35 cap on insulin per month. Those are the key.
Thank you. Yeah, and even if that $200 they had to pay was on a monthly basis, that's $2,400, right, annually?
Sure.
So they're going to see at least $400 in reduction.
And a lot of seniors take multiple drugs, not just one. They'll take 4, 5, 6, depending on the need.
And am I also correct that extending the Affordable Care Act subsidies allowed an additional 13 million people to get coverage, and so we're extending those subsidies for 3 more years?
Yes. So when we did the American Rescue Plan, we had enhanced subsidies at every level, because, as you pay a certain amount depending upon your income, and the rest is subsidized. All those were significantly increased for the years 2021 and 2021 and 2022. And then for the first time, we also provided some subsidy if your income was above 400% of poverty, which, in a state like mine in New Jersey, if you have a family of four, you can easily get above that 400%, right? It's at middle class, really, at that point. So that is extended for the next 3 years. So for 23, 24, and 25. And we now have the highest, as a result of that enhanced subsidy over the last 2 years during the Biden administration, the level of people that are uninsured is at an all-time low. And we want that to continue.
That's amazing. Mr. Byer, do you have the IRS issues in your bucket? Do I have that right?
Among others, yes, I do. Very good.
Among others. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting as this bill has worked its way through committees, first in the House and then in the Senate, certainly all of us over the last few years have had to deal with complaints about the IRS not being able to process tax returns in a timely fashion, not being able to get people their stimulus checks. So I've learned over that time that that it's seriously underfunded and understaffed to do its job, and also that we're anticipating tens of thousands of IRS agents to retire in 2 years. So we essentially have a shop that needs to be propped. But I've also been kind of stunned to learn about the fact that the IRS is still operating on a computer system, the COBOL system, which was antique, I think, when I was in college. So can you tell us a little bit about how the investments that this act is going to can help the IRS do its job, so it brings in dollars that people, particularly rich people and rich corporations, owe, so that we can fund the government in a way that it benefits everybody?
Thank you for framing the issue so very well, and for giving us a chance to point out again that so many of the ways it's been characterized by our Republican friends are just not fair or accurate. Let's begin with the fact that the greatest expectation is that the IRS may, with this investment, get back to the employment level they had in 2010, 12 years ago. Let's also add to the fact that there's nothing wrong with having IRS staff become increasingly efficient over the years, so perhaps they could deal with twice as many claims with fewer people, but there was no IT improvement over those years as they were starved. So I don't know anybody that's taught COBOL for 20 or 25 years. So we're really running into the danger, not only an antiquated system, but a system that few people around left still to even program or improve. My friend from Missouri said that only 4% is dedicated to direct customer service. That may be technically right, but remember, those are the taxpayer advocates. Most of the taxpayer folks are processors. They don't have direct customer service. They're going to try to deal with those 10 million backlog of individual IRS claims that are sitting in IRS cafeterias around the country. By the way, too, a significant part of that $80 billion will be spent on improving the computer systems, the IT, which, by the way, makes the processors and the customer service agents that much more efficient. Hopefully the backlog in terms of return telephone calls or just answered telephone calls will go way, way down because of this investment. And what we have to continue to say is 87,000 new auditors, 87,000 new agents, it just isn't happening. One of my friends on the other side said, how many billionaires are there? Only 700. However, there are 20.2 million millionaires in America. And that millionaire is 1 million to 999 million. So there are going to be many, many people, way more than 700, who are in the category of underreporting their income and where an audit actually makes sense. Audits barely fell for people making less than $200,000. They plummeted for people making more than $1 million a year. That will perhaps be rectified with this IRS investment.
And I understand that a lot of the impetus for the investment is to deal with that. Certainly millionaires and billionaires are not filling out their income tax forms themselves. They have armies of people helping them try to evade taxes. So I think this is a wise investment for the country, particularly, I mean, we've got some prime examples of folks who claim to have been under audit for years and years. Otherwise, they would have revealed their tax returns. So I think this is a good investment.
Charlie Rosati, who had been one of the IRS commissioners, hopefully again, not one of the so-called corrupt IRS commissioners referred to by an earlier friend, that those of us with W-2 incomes and 1099 incomes, and most of the people on this call, all of us, I hope, report 99% of our income. But those that have lots of other passive income sources, stocks and bonds, real estate and the like, perhaps as little as 50% of that is reported. And so that's where the huge tax audit, the unpaid but due taxes, the fair tax share is missed out, and why a stronger IRS can help collect that.
Thank you. And the last thing, as I understand it, well, so we know that our national deficit ballooned following the 2017 Republican tax cut bill. How is this bill supposed to help our national deficit? It brings it down, doesn't it?
It brings it down quite a bit. And it's really the first down payment on that we've had structurally in quite a long time. Let's also note that I just read yesterday that the deficit's down, I believe, 1.72 trillion just from last year. We're making an enormous progress from the deficit that was built up in the last years of the Trump administration because of the COVID crisis. And Democrats and Republicans together voted for those COVID relief bills that pushed it up. But we're moving in strongly in the right direction. And now for the first time, we're actually making a significant down payment on it.
Thank you. And of course, the largest tranche of spending in this bill does have to do with crime reduction and making the types of investment that are so important. Mr. Yarmuth, if you could just highlight, what do you think is the most important climate piece here?
Well, again, I think, thank you for the question. I think the most important thing is that we are changing the incentive structure of the government in order to put us in a certain direction. And the aggregate effect of this, both in terms of promoting electric vehicles, renewable energy, all of these things, mitigation techniques, resiliency, all are going to push us in the direction where a variety of expert organizations have said will help us meet our goal of reducing carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. That's an enormous amount of progress to be made in 8 years. And again, we've never even approached this kind of government initiative to deal not just with climate change, but also to set us on an energy efficient economy that will save consumers a lot of money. And if I can just add one thing, I've been chomping at the bit a little bit. Ranking Member Smith, again, scare tactics, threw up this notion of 700,000 additional audits being done of this. There are 150 million individual tax returns filed in the country every year. 150 million. So you're talking about an additional 0.5% of audits, where we know that hundreds of billions of dollars of money that is owed but not paid and is out there for us to capture. And the idea that we are inconveniencing anybody or we're on some kind of assault on America's middle class because we're going to increase audits by 0.5% is just ludicrous.
Thank you. Thank all of you for your testimony. I mean, I'm really looking forward to voting for this bill because I think it does address some of the most pressing problems for our constituents in our country. The high cost of healthcare, the deficits that drive inflation, the climate change issues that are so front of mind, particularly for our young people. So, you know, maybe not everything we want is in here, but I think it's a great bill, and I'm looking forward to voting on it on Friday. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to yield to Ms. Fischbach.
I appreciate the opportunity. And, you know, first, I just would like to address the agriculture funding in the bill. The funding levels have not been considered in markup. We have no idea if the USDA even has the capacity to properly utilize the amount of funds provided, seeing as they work with around 900 million dollars each year compared to the roughly 20 billion provided under this bill. This is not to mention the major staffing shortages that impair the even current funding level we provide. Altogether, I have serious concerns over the potential for abuse and misuse of taxpayer funds given these factors. This funding is for Farm Bill programs outside of the Farm Bill process, meaning again, it has not received any hearings or debate within the House Agriculture Committee. It has not received input from our side of the aisle, meaning it circumvents the traditionally bipartisan process of creating a Farm Bill. It has not received any input from stakeholders. There is no doubt that this will complicate the Farm Bill process, which has already begun, but needs to be complete next year. More importantly, I was just out in the district doing farm tours and visiting with producers. Not a single one of the farmers I spoke to asked for this funding. They are asking us to address fuel costs, input costs, inflation, supply chains, and bureaucratic overreach, issues unaddressed in the bill before us. I think it goes to show my colleagues' priorities and how out of touch this legislation is with the American people. I do have a couple of questions. I did want to ask Ranking Member Smith. Ranking Member, proponents of the bill argue that this legislation will fight inflation by reducing the deficit. And I think we've talked a little bit about it. As I understand it, the bill increases the deficit in the short term. Is the bill providing the kind of front-loaded deficit reduction that would be expected to help with inflation?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. Thanks for the question. If you even follow and go along with the budget gimmicks and the fake sunsets that the Democrats have put in this bill, the first 5 years, Representative, the first 5 years underneath this bill will add 54 billion to the debt. 54 billion, and 80% of their projected deficit reduction doesn't begin until the year 2029. That's 7 years down the road, Representative, to start addressing inflation. 7 years. And those are the facts. If anyone wants to argue those facts, let's do it. But the first 5 years under their fake budget gimmicks and sunsets, under that, $54 billion is added to the debt.
And Ranking Member Smith, I would think that we would want to reduce the deficit now while the inflation is at record highs. And I'm assuming you would agree with that.
Absolutely. The reason why we have the problem with this inflation is the trillions of dollars of reckless government spending. And they're trying to inject $745 billion more dollars of spending and adding almost $150 billion to the debt. But under even their budget gimmicks and fake sunsets, it's adding $54 billion to the debt in the first 5 years. Representative, I know the IRS audits have came up so many times. I just want to, it has some real impacts on people. And I was just looking at your state. I wanted to point this out to you. With this proposal, for families who make less than $200,000 a year in the state of Minnesota, 17,000 more families will face an audit with the IRS because of this $80 billion investment to hire more IRS agents. I don't think the folks of Minnesota would be happy with that.
And I would agree. Thank you for pointing that out, Representative Smith. And the other, I did want to, Congressman Smith, just give you the opportunity to comment. Even though you're on Zoom and I am too, I can see you react to some of the statements that have been made. And so I wanted to give you the opportunity, if there was anything that has been said that you wanted to comment, that you would have that opportunity.
Representative, I thank you very much. I've been grateful that I've been able to respond to a lot of them. But in regards to the tax burden that's being affected because of the tax increases on here, I just want to point out that the joint tax has said that 1/4 1/4 of all corporate tax increases will rest on individuals. 1/4 of it will rest on individuals. So those are tax increases that's going to fall right on the taxpayer. And joint tax has said that. This bill right here does two horrible things. It spends hundreds of more billions of dollars, and it taxes hundreds of billions of more dollars. The idea that the solution to our inflation crisis and the idea of our solution to the recession is to spend our way out of inflation and to tax our way out of recession, the American people aren't buying it. They're not going to support it. You can push all the numbers you want on polling saying that the American people want it. This is an environmentalist wish dream. This is a proposal to try to buy off a lot of the wealthy environmental donors at the expense of hardworking Americans who are surviving barely to put food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gasoline in their cars. And this is only going to continue to drive inflation. It's going to make inflation longer in this country and worse in this country.
Well, and I thank you very much for that, Ranking Member Smith. And I just wanted to turn to Mr. Carter for just a moment and just offer him the opportunity. I know you kind of have joined the conversation late, but if there was something that you had heard that you would want to comment, Mr. Carter.
Well, I thank the lady for yielding. And yeah, I want to comment. I've been sitting here listening to y'all talk about drug pricing and how this is going to help. Listen, everyone here collectively doesn't understand drug pricing as well as I do. I have lived it. I've practiced it for 42 years. I've practiced pharmacy. And you're missing the point here. It's not the drug manufacturers. It's the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen. They're the ones that are making the profits here. And who owns the PBMs? The insurance companies. That's who owns it. Why is the FTC undertaking a study right now, as we speak, to look at the vertical integration that exists in drug pricing now, where the insurance company owns the PBM and owns the pharmacy? They're going to make money along the way. The Berkeley Research Group just did a study about 3 months ago that showed that only 37% of the price of a prescription drug goes to the pharmaceutical manufacturer. The rest of it, where does that go? The 63%? It goes to the PBM. They get rebates. Do they pass them on to the customers? No, they don't pass them on to the customers. They keep them. And who is the PBM? It's the insurance company. And what are we doing here? You're simply pumping up the insurance companies. That's why I've got legislation. And look, nobody knows better than I do. I was on the other side of the counter for 42 years. I was the one who had to go tell people how much their prescription was going to cost them. I was the one who had to watch them make a decision, the senior citizens make a decision between getting groceries or getting drugs. I was the one that watched the mother in tears call a family member trying to get money to pay for her antibiotic for her child. That was me. I was the one on the other side of the counter. I know all too well how big of a problem this is. I also know all too well how much research and development means. Let me tell you, folks, I started practicing pharmacy in 1980. And when I started practicing in 1980, if you were diagnosed with hepatitis C, you were going to die. You were going to die if you were diagnosed with hepatitis C. Today, we can cure it with a pill. One pill, we can cure it. How phenomenal is that? And what's that a result of? The research and development. Now, do pharmaceutical manufacturers need to do a better job with their pricing? Yes, they do. There's no question about that. But I'm telling you, you're missing the point here. It's not just them. It's primarily the PBMs. How long have I been preaching that? For 8 years since I've been in Congress. 8 years. You got to have transparency in the drug pricing chain. These PBMs are keeping their profits. They're keeping those rebates. They're the ones who are holding the drug companies hostage and saying, if you want to get on our formulary, you give me a rebate. That's the way you're going to get on our formulary. You go to the doctor and you get diagnosed with high blood pressure, and they're going to tell you, your insurance company is going to tell you, this is the drug that you can use for high blood pressure. I don't care about the side effect profile that you have. It doesn't matter to me. What matters is that we're getting the biggest rebate right here. And therefore, that's what you're going to get. That's the drug you're going to get because it's on our formulary. Hey, if you want to pay more, that's fine. But if you're going to pay this copay, this is what you're going to get because I'm getting the biggest rebate from them. Look, I've got an amendment I'd like to talk about. The biopharmaceutical companies, they bring cures to patients.
Mr. Carter, we're not at the amendment stage. You can testify after this panel about your amendment, but this is a question and answers, the opening panel, so.
Hey, keep railing then, that's fine.
All right. Well, I thank you, Mr. Carter, and I appreciate that. And I think that your discussion about the PBMs and the input there points out once again that if the bill had really been any kind of discussion and input from all of the members or more of the members, that it certainly would have been an improved bill and you would have addressed some of those things. And just once again, disappointing that we don't follow regular order and do the kinds of things to get the input from all the sides and all of the input that we should when we're putting together legislation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I just want to, again, re-enter into the record because it seems that we keep on going down this IRS conspiracy theory, embracing some IRS conspiracy theory of somehow that this money is designed to go after Walmart shoppers or people who earn under $400,000 a year. I want to reinsert into the record the letter from the commissioner of the IRS, which basically disputes that. And just humor me, Mr. Byer, who appointed the current IRS commissioner?
Donald Trump appointed the current.
Yeah, maybe I should be scared by that. But the bottom line is, I just think it's important to know that that's from Donald Trump's IRS commissioner. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by associating myself with your comments at the outset about our colleague, Ms. Walorski, and her staff, and keep them in our thoughts and prayers. And I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming before the committee this afternoon, Chairman Pallone and Yarmouth and Byer and Ranking Member Smith. It's great to have you all with us. You know, I'm as I've heard this discussion this afternoon, I'm sort of reminded of that old quote from Shakespeare. Only in this case, it's the GOP instead of my lady. Much, methinks. I actually disagree with Ranking Member Smith. I think this is exactly what the American people want. I think it's what they want us to do. And I think we'll find over the next several weeks as people begin to digest the elements of this, I think you're going to find that there is widespread support for it. But I want to take a moment. I think all the discussion has been very illuminating. You've sort of gone through each of the parts of the bill. But I wanted to take a moment to focus on one of the things that I'm most focused on in talking to constituents and what I've heard for now years, and that's the measures to cut the cost of prescription drugs. And for years, we've been lamenting this skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs, how much this takes out of a family's budget. We've talked about how exponentially more expensive medications are in America than in most of the industrialized world. And we've seen the devastating toll it's taken on our constituents who are forced to either ration medication or skip doses because they can't afford to refill their prescription. Earlier today, I was with a constituent, Susan, who I didn't ask her, but is likely a Walmart shopper. Susan is 72 years old. She's not working, not because she gets to enjoy a comfortable retirement, but because of disability from spinal stenosis, a condition that puts significant pressure on the spinal column and greatly restricts movement. On top of that, Susan has diabetes and a host of other medical challenges no doubt made more difficult by the spinal stenosis. She relies on 10 different medications. The cost is astronomical. She used a term today in our conversation that I had not heard before, drug hopping. She said she does a number of things. First is she'll take half a pill instead of a full pill. She'll also go through the 10 different medications that she's on, and she sort of prioritizes what she can take at any given moment. She has a heart condition, so she takes the heart drug every day, she said, because she wants to keep on living. The other drugs, she sort of parses out, not according to the dosage given to her by her doctor, but what she can afford. She also swaps drugs with her friends. She'll find those that have some extra of something. Maybe she has extra of something or can put off taking something, and they give it back and forth. I'd never heard the term. I didn't know that people went to such extraordinary lengths to make sure that she said, I can keep living because I like life and I want to do whatever I can to stay here and be here. The legislation we're talking about today is going to change Susan's life in fundamental ways. Allowing Medicare, which, by the way, this is about as a Republican a principle as you can get, using the big volume of purchasing, using the ability of the size of purchase you do to exact the best price you can. I mean, that's sort of market-based economics 101. I didn't do so well in school, but I remember that from my State University macroeconomics 101 course. So this is about making sure that as we're buying and making use of the economies of scale, that we're able to do that. It's unimaginable to me that for 57 years that Medicare's been around, that we haven't done it long before this. So that's going to lower the cost. The cost of insulin, reducing that to $35 a month for Medicare is really life-altering, because this is not only a life-saving, it's a life-sustaining drug. People cannot live without it if you have diabetes. And there are millions of Americans, particularly older Americans, who continue to have diabetes, get diabetes in younger year onset. And this will be life-saving for them, as will, and people have mentioned before, the annual cap on out-of-pocket costs is transformative. Susan, paying 10 for 10 prescriptions, spends well in excess of $2,000 a year on her out-of-pocket costs. This is going to change her life. She actually wept while we were talking about this. Real tears, talking about how difficult her life has been, how she can't go out with friends. She can't go to restaurants. She said she can't even go to McDonald's because the cost of doing what she has to do to maintain her health is just so excessive. And she was weeping tears of joy talking about what we're doing. So at a time when costs are already high, especially for older Americans living on fixed incomes, the savings from the legislation will mean the difference between paying the air conditioning bill and utilities or not, affording groceries to put on the table or not. This is delivering real relief for families. So for all the talk that we have in Washington and all the things that we often talk about that seem sort of hard to touch, that aren't tactile, this is. And I know Susan and all the other seniors that I met with this afternoon desperately want this. There's much more to do. I think others talked about it, particularly on the private insurance side, to again use the size of purchasing power to drive down the cost of prescription drugs. It should be for all Americans, not just for seniors. But given the limitations of the Senate, we have what we have. So we're going to continue to fight for those, and I appreciate particularly Chairman Pallone on this issue, your continued advocacy for it. But at the end of the day, no family should be forced to choose between filling a prescription and having food to eat. So this is an important step forward. It is real. It affects people day to day. I'm proud to support the underlying bill, and I'm looking forward to voting for the bill and certainly in support of the rule. And again, thank you to our chairs and the ranking member for being here. And with that, Ms. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I make my remarks, I just want to remind the committee, I know I'm just a freshman, so I did all my research, like why we're going to have 3 hours of debate and all the rest tomorrow. But this bill is back to us on concurrence, and it has gone through regular order. And I was a state legislator, and what happens is You do all your work on your side, you send it to the other side, they do all the work, they don't do things you like sometimes, they do other things you like, and then they send it back for concurrence. And what they've sent us back, maybe not everything we want, but it's pretty good. And my constituents want it, so I'm going to concur. And with that, I just want to kind of give this a little context. At the start of this Congress, which has been quite a Congress, I mean, I was appointed to the Rules Committee and then had to come the next morning and deal with impeachment for a president who clearly has been derelict in his duties, or was. We faced unprecedented challenges, including the pandemic. And we have stepped up for the American people to deliver meaningful relief. We are putting people before politics. And this is a once in a generation bill, and it's an example of our efforts. And it deals with issues that Congress has simply just kicked the can down the road about. And you've heard about them all afternoon. It's a monumental piece of legislation that will reshape and improve our country's commitment to major issues affecting every single American. It reduces healthcare costs for families. It slashes greenhouse gas emissions. It invests in clean energy. It creates millions of manufacturing jobs, and it ensures that businesses pay their fair share. For decades, we have heard from Americans of all backgrounds imploring Congress to find solutions for these concerns. This legislation, it takes us one step forward to doing that. I'm particularly excited that this bill represents the most significant investment to combat climate change in U.S. history, ever. It's an investment in clean energy that will strengthen our energy independence and lower energy costs for consumers across the country. In my home state of North Carolina, we've dedicated years to rethinking and improving our renewable energy options, and we are a leader in the Southeast and in the country. We recently announced a historic $1.2 billion investment in VinFast, an electric car manufacturing company set to bring over 7,500 jobs to our state. And I've spent the past year working across the aisle to create offshore wind opportunities in North Carolina, which are supported by our major utilities and the Chamber of Commerce. Offshore wind energy represents one of the best options in our toolbox to reach our clean energy goals, powering millions of homes, lowering prices, and creating thousands of high-quality jobs. My state is perfectly positioned to lead this multi-billion-dollar industry. And I'm pleased that this bill will end. We talked about the prior administration. They had a moratorium on offshore wind leasing, just kind of shutting down options for our utility and for our future. This act takes North Carolina's investment in clean energy and multiplies them, substantially improving Americans' lives and bolstering our nation's capabilities, all while reducing the deficit. We will be reducing the deficit for generations to come. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak on this historic legislation and to vote in support of the rule and the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I want to ask unanimous consent to put into the record a couple of letters. One, a business support statement for the Inflation Reduction Act signed by some of the nation's leading energy companies, and also a letter from the small business majority strongly in support of this bill, saying that the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 strengthens small business by closing tax loopholes and ensuring that large corporations are held accountable and pay their fair share. This is critically important because our nation's tax system has unfairly benefited the largest corporations at the expense of small business owners, their employees, and independent entrepreneurs. They also say that the proposed bill also includes support for access to affordable, quality health care, which we know significantly impacts small businesses and their employees because they have historically comprised a disproportionate share of the working uninsured populations. And I will have those in the record. And Dr. Burgess is on his way here. And so if people could just be patient because he was unable to ask his questions in the car. Just, are you almost here, or do you want to ask your questions from where you are?
Do we?
No,
It's hard.
I don't think we can hear you from the car.
Mr. Chairman, can he yield to me?
I'm happy to yield to you. Mr. Carter, do you want to be yielded to?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I want to finish what I had started a few minutes ago about this drug pricing part of this. And listen, this is serious. I've been doing this ever since I've been in Congress. Finally, you know, the first thing I did when I got to Congress was go to the FTC and tell them, you need to look at the vertical integration that has taken place in the drug pricing chain. The fact that the insurance company owns the PBM and owns the pharmacy. They are practicing steering. They steer their patients to their pharmacy so that they can make the most. They are practicing, as I said, they're getting these rebates. And what we're doing, we all agree, Republicans and Democrats, we need to bring down prescription drug prices. But the Hippocratic Oath tells us, do no harm. What this bill is going to do is going to be harmful because it's going to deter and kill research and development at a time we can ill afford it. It is going to do that. We need cures. We need a cure for Alzheimer's. The price that we're going to have to pay, both financially and emotionally, the strain on families that Alzheimer's brings, the strain on the caregivers, all of that is going to have a tremendous burden on our society if we don't find cures for it. And here we are trying to pass this bill that's going to do just the opposite of what we need to be doing. And I have to defer, and I have to disagree with my good friend, the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. H.R. 19 is not a partisan bill. It is a bipartisan bill, and it has solutions in it that will achieve what all of us want to achieve. That is to bring down prescription drug pricing, but it will do it in such a way that it won't kill research and development. And what we're doing, or what y'all are doing in this one with this this is not negotiation. This is extortion. What you're doing to the drug companies here is extortion.
All right.
And one last thing, I just got to tell you, this is going to kill research and development at a time we can least afford to do it. We all want the same thing here, and I'll yield.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond.
I'm happy to yield to the briefly to the gentleman from New Jersey, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Look, Mr. Carter, you know I admire you, but look, the bottom line is H.R. 19, the Republican alternative, sure, it does have something around the edges in terms of capping costs out of pocket and inflation, but it does not deal with negotiated prices, and that's the only significant way that you're going to bring down prices. And look, I'm more than willing to work with you to address the PBM problem, but the fact of the matter is it's the pharmaceutical industry that sets list price for the drugs, and the drug manufacturers increase the prices year after year. In the number of price increases for the first 7 months of 2022 exceeded the 2020 and 21 hikes in the same period. And this year so far, there have been 1,186 price hikes for prescription drugs, and 64 different pharmaceutical companies have increased prices so far this year. It is not fair for the American people to continue to pay these high prices, but every other developed country in the world does not. The S&P increase says that the pharmaceutical industry has had a bigger profit than any other industry in the last few years. There's no way in the world that they don't have enough money to do research and innovation. Most of them, 7 out of 10 of them, Mr. Carter, spend more money on advertising than they do on research, and the government ends up funding most of the research anyway. So this idea that it's just not fair. It's not fair to the average American that we have to continue to pay these high prices because the pharmaceuticals say, oh, we need this money for research. They're just getting profits. They're paying it back to their shareholders. They're taking out ads so people buy the drugs. They're not spending most of the money on research. It's just not the case. But anyway, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate both of you offering some filler as we're waiting for Dr. Burgess. But I'm going to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee. And again, I think, let me just reiterate that we're here today to lower costs for hardworking Americans. And this bill would lower prescription drug costs. It protects affordable health care coverage for millions of people, and it lowers energy costs for consumers. We're also making the boldest investment in our history to combat the climate crisis, putting our country on a path to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. This bill will start to unrig this tax code by finally making corporations and wealthy start to pay their fair share in taxes. My constituents don't understand why big corporations could avoid paying taxes, but they can't. And we're doing this all while reducing the deficit. And let me just say one final thing about prescription drugs. Some of these drugs don't do any good if you can't afford them. And I've got a lot of senior citizens. I've got a lot of families that are struggling to be able to pay for their prescription drugs and to pay to put food on the table or pay for their rent or their utility costs or a number of other things. And so, 73% of the American people think that what we're doing here on prescription drugs is the right thing to do. And so I will proudly support this bill. I am. Do you have anything to say?
Mr. Chair, will you yield?
I think, Mr. Carter, I think we've already gone through the questions. We're just waiting for Dr. Burgess. So I think Dr. Burgess, we lost him somewhere. But any event, he will be. Who's?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jason Smith.
Yes.
Could I enter into the record a joint committee on tax distribution analysis that just came in on the tax provisions of the bill?
Without objection. And anything anybody wants to enter into the record, they may do so without objection. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I want to thank our witnesses for being here. I was going to ask Mr. Byer one more time who appointed the current commissioner of the IRS, but. Yeah, I'm just in case anybody's unsure.
I believe it was the previous president, Mr. Trump.
But please leave any information you have with us, stenographer, or submit electronically. Anything you would like inserted in the record, you are now excused. And I thank you all for being here. We tried. You overtried. We now want to, let me see, does any member wish to offer an amendment to this bill? I want to welcome our next panel to testify on amendments to the Inflation Reduction Act, Mr. Estes, Mr. Carter, and Mr. Burgess. So I'll go with Mr. Carter because you're here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Cole for allowing me to speak on my amendment this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, you've heard me speak about PBMs, and as you can imagine, my amendment is about PBMs. But two things I want to point out. You just made a statement, Mr. Chairman, and I have to correct. You said that some of these drugs, that many of these drugs don't do any good if you can't afford them. I would submit to you that none of these drugs do any good if you can't afford them. If you can't afford to buy it, none of them are going to do you any good. So I just want to make sure we understand that. The only other thing I want to point out before I'll get into my written testimony here is the fact that, as I stated earlier, only 37% of the price of a drug goes to the pharmaceutical manufacturer. The other 63% goes to the PBM, i.e. insurance company. Now, you've cited numbers on how much money that pharmaceutical manufacturers spend on research and development. How much do PBMs, how much do insurance companies spend on research and development? Absolutely nothing. That's how much they spend on research and development. At least the drug companies are spending some of it on research and development. So if you want to do some good, do away with rebates, period. Or make sure they're done at the point of sale. Make sure they're done at the point of sale so that they can go where they should go, and that is to the patient. That's why, Mr. Chairman, it's important for us to lower drug costs without the risk of fewer cures by forcing pharmacy benefit managers to fully pass rebates to patients at the pharmacy counter. My amendment would do just that. It would force the PBMs to pass every last penny, not just some of it, but every bit of it, to the patients at the pharmacy counter instead of letting the PBMs steal those dollars to pad their own pockets. The PBMs, i.e. the insurance companies. In 2020, more than half of all spending on brand prescription medicines went to someone other than the biopharmaceutical manufacturers who researched, developed, and manufactured the medicines. My Democratic colleagues claim to want to lower drug costs, but they're letting PBMs off scot-free. PBMs offer nothing. They offer nothing to patients, and they certainly do not help lower drug costs. They bring no benefit whatsoever to the healthcare system. Furthermore, what's outrageous is that the Biden administration, on one hand, has finalized the DIR rule, yet on the other hand, Congress is using the rebate rule, which operates under the same principle of returning price concessions to patients at the point of sale, as a piggy bank to enable its prolific spending spree. In fact, the CMS Office of the Actuary estimated that its DIR policy would save seniors a total of $33.1 billion in cost sharing over the next 10 years. And even when accounting for the purported increase in Medicare D premiums, which I dispute, and numerous external studies and organizations also, beneficiaries on net still save $21.3 billion over that period of time. The rule clearly states lower point of sale prices would result directly in lower cost sharing costs for non-low income beneficiaries. And on average, we expect these cost sharing decreases would exceed the premium increases. While I don't agree with the rule's premise that this policy would increase premiums, I'm glad that HHS and CMS on the same page that this policy would still save patients money at the pharmacy counter, significantly more money than any purported premium impact. Which leads me to my next question for my Democratic colleagues. How did the CMS Office of the Actuary, the same office who I understand conducted the analysis in this year's Part D rule and DIR policy, so-called rebate rule would have saved patients over $25 billion in the net cost over 10 years? To clarify, that means the aggregate reduction in patient cost sharing would have been $25 billion greater than the estimated premium increase. Why are they okay with saving patients at the pharmacy counter in the DIR rule, but insist on separately using the rebate rule, which would do likewise for patients, as a piggy bank for new Obamacare spending and unrelated energy programs? If you truly care about lowering drug costs, you should vote for my amendment and stop letting PBMs get away with these egregious practices in this highway robbery. And I've just got to end it with this. I've had at least 3 Democratic colleagues come to me and say, you're right, our policy is wrong. Now, they're going to vote for your bill. There's no question. They told me I got to vote for it. But they have come to me and told me personally, next session when y'all are in charge, we want to work with you to get these PBMs to lower drug prices. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole, and actually to everybody on the Rules Committee for considering my amendment. I want to talk today about Amendment 42, which highlights how we need to focus on the economy. You know, this morning we learned that inflation is still rampant and hurting families. And the White House tried to spin this as good news and proof that inflation's easing. But Kansas families are still spending 8.5% more today than they were a year ago. And that was on top of 5.4% through July of last year. So we're seeing everyday expenses and necessities up for family members. Milk's up 15.6%, eggs up 38%, baby food's up 15%, bacon's up 11%, and gas is still up 44%. And the worst statistic of the day is the real hourly wages are down 3%. So President Biden and the Democrats are in this bubble trying to push the narrative that it's a strong economy, but Americans aren't really buying it because they can't afford it. As members of the Rules Committee and representatives of your respective districts, I'm sure you're hearing from your constituents that price increases and the impact they're having on paychecks are just crushing them. The American economy is suffering, and the policies from the majority are destroying the American dream. So in response, now the House is going to consider this highly partisan bill that doubles down on the bad policies that got us here, more spending on these bad priorities. The bill that's being talked about, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, doesn't really reduce inflation at all, according to the Penn-Wharton budget model and the Congressional Budget Office. Instead, it increases taxes, increases spending, and continues to increase inflation and hamstring the economy. So how do we make that better? How can we actually improve the lives of Kansans and Americans across the country? We can start with some bipartisan common sense amendment like the one I'm introducing today, Amendment number 42. My amendment's a temporary extension of the Research and Development Expensing Tax Credit through the end of 2025. Research and development's key for short-term and long-term economic growth in the country, and immediate expensing of R&D costs will boost the R&D here in the United States. We know that where R&D occurs, it's critical for job creation and job growth. In the case of the R&D tax implications, full expensing was allowed through 2021. However, starting this year, businesses will be required to spread out or amortize those expenses over a 5-year period for domestic R&D or 15 years for foreign R&D. This spreading out of expenses will significantly diminish the near-term value and the likelihood of research investments, making us the only developed country requiring R&D expenditures to be amortized. When compared to the leading markets around the world, the United States ranks 26th out of 36 for the value of our R&D tax incentives. At a time when it's critical for our economy to become more competitive, spreading the R&D expenses would make us less competitive. In 2020, the Tax Foundation said immediate expensing of all investments, including R&D expensing, is the #1 federal reform that Congress can make to encourage economic recovery after COVID-19. I've introduced and reintroduced a bill with Democratic Congressman John Larson from Connecticut, the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, to allow companies to immediately expense R&D permanently. While I believe we should move towards a permanent solution, my amendment today would at least provide some certainty to American job creators, innovators, and workers for the next few years. The National Taxpayers Union has called my bipartisan bill a no-brainer for passage, and I think the amendment today should be a no-brainer as well. Today's R&D dollars create tomorrow's jobs, and we need to keep R&D dollars inside our country where we can help strengthen the American businesses, workers, and our economy, and help create more jobs for Americans. So with that, I look forward to questions, and I hope you consider including my amendment in this bill.
Thank you very much. I'm now happy to yield to Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two amendments. The first is amendment number 11. The amendment would remove doctors from the middle of drug pricing negotiations between the government and drug manufacturers. You know, look, we do face a serious problem with the nation's physicians. They've been through goodness knows what with the pandemic for 2 years, and they are facing a series of cuts. The physician fee schedule update for this year is calculated to be 0%. You know what that means in Washington, D.C. 0%, in fact, means a cut, especially when you got 9% inflation. because we have put such a burden on physicians, I really think this amendment is going to be important to alleviate some of that burden. This amendment was offered with Dr. Murphy of North Carolina and allowed drug manufacturers to directly refund the government excess costs above the negotiated prices. We heard this talked about, Mr. Pallone talked about the rebate that would be refunded if a company, a pharmaceutical company brought its prices up too quickly. But there is a precedent for drug manufacturers to rebate the government. This amendment would actually just remove the physicians from the negotiation process. Our goal should be to achieve cost savings without threatening the stability of providers or their practices, or actually should say further threatening the stability of providers and their practices. I've heard directly from docs that they would face significant financial risks under this legislation, which in turn would affect America's patients. In fact, the GOP Doctors Caucus recently sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer on how this bill would affect our healthcare system. Over the years, we've seen specialty practices close. I've been especially concerned, especially in the language in this reconciliation bill, that oncology practices, rheumatology practices, neurology practices, those that administer Part B drugs that would see the pricing structure change dramatically are going to be hard hit, and we are quite frankly going to see practices close. Patients will still be taken care of, but they'll end up being taken care of at a site of service that is that actually costs more. It costs about a third to see a patient in a physician's office what it does to see them in the hospital. And yet we're going to be driving patients out of community oncology centers into hospitals to get their cancer care, and the result will be a higher cost, no savings to anyone. To avoid the consequences of this bill, we should remove docs from the process entirely. For congressional colleagues who are curious how this bill would affect providers and patients in their districts, I encourage you to read the letter signed by nearly all 21 healthcare professionals in Congress to support this amendment, and I'd ask unanimous consent to put that letter into the record.
Without objection.
The second amendment is number 53. This amendment would require that 100% of the rebate on insulin be passed down to the patient at the pharmacy counter. I recently introduced the Insulin Savings for Patients Act. This act would allow a phase-in in rebate on insulin in Medicare Part D from 50% to 100% over 3 years. The rebate will be passed on to the patients at the point of sale. This amendment would build off the concept and pass 100% of the rebate on insulin to the patient at the time of purchase in the pharmacy. 1 in 3 Medicare beneficiaries have diabetes. Millions of seniors rely on insulin to live healthy lives. And we're discussing ways to lower out-of-pocket costs for patients' drug. This amendment is one solution that most certainly makes the monthly cost of a patient's insulin more affordable for the millions of Medicare beneficiaries with diabetes. An analysis that I have found that passing the rebate through to the patients in the commercial market could actually save certain diabetes patients as much as $800 annually while increasing premiums by just 1%. Another study found that if discounts were passed directly to patients at the pharmacy counter, a typical Part D patient with diabetes taking 5 medicines, including insulin, could see their out-of-pocket spending decrease by more than $900 a year. Additionally, one could argue that reducing out-of-pocket insulin costs for individuals with diabetes could potentially have a positive impact on adherence. This common sense approach to accomplishing just that is worth our consideration. Our drugs pricing system is structured in a way that allows for rebates, but patients do not see the benefit of these rebates. This amendment would require that not just 100% pass through of the rebate dollars, but would require a study to further improve the Congress's knowledge on what insulin pricing policies we could pursue. It's the common sense amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I urge it be made in order.
I thank the gentleman for his amendments. Let's see, anybody have a question? Ms. Torres? Mr. Cole? Mr. Perlmutter? Dr. Burgess?
I've actually got some really good questions for you. Thank you for being so patient with me today. It's been a tough day.
No, and we've been through a lot today, so but I appreciate you making it here. Does anybody on either side have any questions?
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to thank the witnesses and especially two of my favorite Republicans, Mr. Carter and Mr. Smith, for being here today.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Hearing
And
none-
Mr. Estes, too.
Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. And please leave with us, stenographer, or submit electronically anything you would like inserted in the record. You are now excused. Are there any other members who wish to testify, to offer amendments on this legislation? Seeing none, that closes the hearing portion. Okay, and then I think we're having some computer issues here. Who's reading the rule? Who's reading the rule? So at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the committee grant a rule providing for the consideration of the Senate amendment to H.R. 5376, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. The rule makes an order or a motion offered by the chair of the committee on the budget or his designee that the House concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 5376. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion and the Senate amendment. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. Finally, the rule provides 3 hours of debate on the motion, equally divided among and controlled by the respective chairs and ranking minority members of the committees on the Budget, Energy and Commerce, and Ways and Means, or their respective designees.
You've heard the motion from the gentleman. Are there any discussion or amendments? Ms. Fischbach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of jump ahead because I do have to get on a flight so I can make it to the funeral tomorrow. And I did want to add earlier, I appreciate all of the kind words about Jackie. She was actually my mentor. So if I seem to flail after this, you'll know why, because I won't have her guidance. So, but I will miss her dearly. And so I'm going to, so like I said, I appreciate the accommodation. But Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 64 to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5376 offered by Mr. Hearn of Oklahoma. This amendment eliminates the Superfund tax during periods of high tax prices and inflation. Mr. Chair, as we have already noted, inflation is already at a 40-year high and has already cost the average American over a month's worth of wages. Even Senate Majority Leader Schumer is on record opposing raising taxes in the midst of a recession. That is why, in the midst of an energy crisis, a border crisis, and an inflation crisis, we shouldn't be further taxing the American people. This amendment would suspend the Superfund tax during periods of high gas prices and high inflation, the very problems we are experiencing right now. Taxing the American people when they have already been taxed by the Democrats' disastrous economic policies is not the right solution. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Appreciate the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Fischbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed,
Aye.
No.
Aye.
Opposed, no?
No.
Oh,
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
would ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Desaulnier?
No.
Mr. Desaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Can you see your other phone?
Ms.
See
Ross?
what date it is?
No. Mr.
No.
Neguse?
No.
Date F.
Mr.
Okay,
Neguse?
F9.
No. Mr.
No.
Cole?
Strike.
Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 65 to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5376, offered by Mr. Rice of South Carolina. This amendment prohibits increased audits of taxpayers with an AGI of 75K or less. Mr. Chairman, with inflation still at a 40-year high and the cost of living on the rise, this amendment would help protect Americans with an adjusted gross income of $75,000 or less from the undue burden of additional audits. Supporters of the bill claim that this will raise revenue by $204 billion for a net of $124 billion, but data shows that this would result in the targeting of 710,000 value shopping Americans earning $75,000 or less. Democrats added allegedly clarifying language, claiming nothing in this section is intended to increase taxes on any taxpayer not in the top 1%. However, intentions are not legally binding. And according to the Tax Foundation, the top 1% means an income of around $545,000. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
So let me, thank you very much. Let me just say a couple of things. We've kind of gone over this ad nauseum here, but the Trump-appointed IRS commissioner has made it clear in a letter to Congress that we have inserted into the record twice, I believe, that the enforcement funding will not be used to increase audits on small businesses or middle-income Americans. In fact, this bill will actually help middle-class families by ensuring that they get their tax refunds more quickly. I think, I mean, I don't know about my colleagues here, but we're getting inundated with calls from citizens and constituents who are waiting for their refunds. You know, and so instead of focusing on what the tax provisions of this bill won't do, let's focus on what it will do. Unrig our tax code by finally making corporations and the wealthy start paying their fair share, and reduce the deficit while we're doing it. Unlike the $2 trillion that was added to the deficit when my friends were in charge with their tax bill. I also just want to say one other thing. You know, I think my friends are aware of the process that we have gone through to get the bill to where it is right now. You change anything in this bill right now, it means that senior citizens will not see lower prescription drug costs. It means that we will invest nothing new to combat the climate crisis. It means that people will see actually their health care costs go up, or their premiums go up, because we will not be able to provide the assistance to offset what insurance companies are already warning citizens might come about if we don't pass this bill. And if we, you know, and again, you change anything, it has to go back to the Senate. And so none of this would be able to be resolved in the short term. That's kind of the nature of reconciliation. So I'm going to urge a no vote on all amendments, because basically any amendment to this bill is about derailing what we're trying to do here. You know, lowering the cost of prescriptions for senior citizens, lowering the cost of health care for millions of families, combating the climate crisis, paying down the debt, dealing with inflation. So I appreciate the gentlelady's amendment, but I will urge a no vote. Mr. Cole.
And
Well,
Mr.
it could be
Chair, may I just
resolved
ask
pretty
for
quickly, Mr.
clarification?
Chairman, in the Senate, because there's only 2 senators have anything to do with it. didn't go through committee. It magically appeared. So I wouldn't worry about the Senate. It can get taken care of pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, as the gentleman knows, there needs to be a vote by the entire Senate, and that is more challenging than not. Ms. Fishbach, you wanted to add something?
Mr. Chair, I was just looking for clarification because you said that it's been made clear. You said there's been information entered into the record. This is the intent. So this shouldn't be an issue to just simply add language that points out exactly what you have been saying, and because intent is not law.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that what you're saying is going to happen is actually going to happen. And that is why you put it in language. And I think that's makes sense to do it. And the Senate, I think, would be willing to accept that. It seems to me if that is actually what the intent of the law is.
As we know, we Republicans in the Senate basically stripped the provision of putting a cap on insulin to $35. So God only knows what will happen if we went back over there. But the bottom line is, I'm putting I never thought I'd say this, I'm actually putting my trust in the Trump-appointed IRS commissioner and the letter that he sent to all of us. And as the gentlelady knows, if we amend this, it basically derails this bill. It means that senior citizens will not get the lower cost prescription drugs that they all want. 73% American people want that. It means health care costs for millions of families will go up. It means there is nothing that we will do to deal with the climate crisis. So if any amendment to this bill at this point basically is derailing this bill. And so I would urge a no vote.
And Mr. Chair, I would just have to say
Absolutely.
that this is once again an example of how the Democrats are running Congress. It is take it or leave it, do it our way or no way. And we are not allowed to have any kind of input because you say, well, can't take any amendments because then it has to go back to the Senate. But I think that's what the legislative process is that give and take and making sure that people have input. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will.
And with all due respect, I'm not sure you were here at the beginning of the hearing when I went over the fact that this is the end of a process. And I actually compared this process to the process that the Republicans used, not only to pass their tax cut bill that benefited mostly the wealthy, but also their attempt to throw millions of people off of health care. And so I just, with all respect, we are at the end of a process right now. The House did its work on this. We sent it over to the Senate. The Senate did its work. Now it's coming back to us. So again, I get the message. This is a time for messaging, but the point of the matter is, if you want to kill the bill, then we adopt the amendments that my friends are going to offer. If we want this bill to go to the President's desk, we need to get it out of rules, we need to bring it to the House floor, and we need to vote for it. Mr. Cole.
With all due respect, it doesn't kill the bill, as my friend from Minnesota points out, to engage in the legislative process. They didn't mind dragging us back here in the summer when they finally got their deal done. I don't mind the Senate staying around a couple of days so people over here, if they have an idea, but it does not kill the bill. It just simply sends it back to the Senate. The Senate can act on it and move it back here quickly.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's put it derails the bill, and it results in some unintended consequences that, quite frankly, are not going to be pleasant for our constituents. So I would urge a no vote. So the vote now is on the Fishback Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I would ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mrs. Ross.
No.
Mrs. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess.
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rechenthaler.
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
How was Mr. Neguse recorded?
Mr. Neguse is not recorded.
Yeah. All right. Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I move that the committee make an order amendment number 88 to the Senate amendment to HR 5376 offered by Mr. Hearn of Oklahoma. This amendment prohibits ACA subsidies from going to Americans making more than 750% of the federal poverty level. Mr. Chairman, I certainly don't begrudge people who have been successful. It's the American dream, and I support that. However, I would hope that all of my colleagues would agree that someone at 750% of the federal poverty level, that's for a family size of one, someone making nearly $102,000 a year, wouldn't need the federal government to be subsidizing their health care costs. With our national debt over $30.6 trillion, we need to be wiser in where we devote our resources. And not subsidizing health care for people who make over $100,000 seems like a great place to start. I urge the adoption of my motion, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
So thank you very much, and what I said earlier stands, but I just want to point out the bill is already means tested. The higher your income, the smaller your tax credit becomes and ultimately phase out. A family whose health insurance premiums are under 8.5% of their income will receive no tax credits at all. So I urge a no vote on the Fishbach amendment. Anybody else? If not, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I request a recorded
Recorded vote
vote.
has been requested.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres.
Torres votes no.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli, no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess.
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rechenthaler.
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. And my friend from Minnesota, I think, is gone now, so thank you for indulging us, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order an amendment number 6 to Senate amendment to H.R. 5376 offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana. This amendment prohibits the bill from taking effect if the Joint Committee on Taxation determines it will cause an increase in taxes or cost of living for those making less than $400,000 a year. Mr. Chairman, just this morning, we learned the Consumer Price Index is at a 40-year high. Wages are not keeping up with inflation and have actually decreased in real terms, while American families continue to pay more for just about everything. Now is not the time to burden hardworking Americans with new taxes and expenses. President Biden has repeatedly pledged to not raise taxes on Americans making less than $400,000. We've been assured that several times in the course of this hearing. This amendment ought to be easy to be accepted because all it does is hold you to account to do what you said you'd do, that nobody's taxes that makes less than $400,000 are going up. So with that, I would move the amendment.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
With that, I request a
Recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres.
Torres, no.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Desaulnier?
No.
Mr. Desaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would ask we make an order amendment number 4 to send amendment H.R. 5376 offered by Mr. Pfluger of Texas. The amendment strikes section 6113, the natural gas tax. Mr. Chairman, we discussed during the hearing, there are serious concerns that the natural gas tax will have severe impacts on consumers and continue to skyrocket the cost of energy in America. Addressing inflation should be a bipartisan effort. And for that reason, it's unfortunate that the Speaker is bringing forth a bill that will only make energy costs worse by putting a tax on natural gas. Given the process that the bill went through, certainly the amendment at least deserves an opportunity for debate on the House floor. I urge adoption of the motion. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I would urge a no vote on the amendment. And I would just, again, say for the record that I think, climate change is an existential threat to humanity. And the extreme heat, the droughts, the flooding, and the wildfires that we've seen this summer are just the beginning. And it's long time past for some real action, and this bill is the most significant investment we've made to combat climate change in U.S. history. And it will also help consumers save money with their utility bills. And I think weakening the clean energy provisions would be, quite frankly, criminally short-sighted. And I would hope that my friends would vote no, but I'll yield to Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'll just make a quick point. First of all, it's natural gas. It's actually lowered greenhouse gases more significantly than any other fuel in recent years. And number two, this will increase the cost of heating and cooling for every single American. There's no reason to do it. We ought to keep the cost low. And frankly, this is the cleanest of all fossil fuels as it is. It's not going away anytime soon, and taxing it, I think, is very short-sighted economically, very regressive in terms of the impact it'll have on lower-income Americans.
Well, I think we'll just have a difference of opinion. But you've heard the amendment. The vote is now on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No. Opinion
No.
the chair, the noes have it. Are we going to work? Yeah,
I request recorded.
a recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres?
Gotta work on our teams.
Torres, no.
Neither side's done.
Mrs. Torres?
Torres, no.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
Raskin votes no.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon?
Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Desaulnier?
No.
Mr. Desaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Nicole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 55 to Senate amendment to H.R. 5376 offered by Mr. Guthrie of Kentucky. This amendment strikes subtitle B of H.R. 5376 and replaces this title with H.R. 19, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act. Mr. Chairman, we can all agree that lowering prescription drug prices for all Americans is a good thing. However, there are severe consequences for doing it the way that the majority is suggesting in this legislation. CBO and the University of Chicago have both found that hundreds of cures will never come to market under the legislation before us today, and those that do will actually have higher prices than without this legislation. Instead, we should be working together, including H.R. 19, a lower cost, more Cures Act. Every single provision of that legislation is bipartisan, and it would avoid the dangerous consequences of government takeover of prescription drugs included in this legislation. So with that, I would urge the adoption of the motion and yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and the reason why I'm supporting this bill is because it is about lowering prescription drug costs for people in this country. And so I would urge a no vote. You've heard the amendment from the gentleman from Oklahoma. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
Oh,
No.
In opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Would you like a recorded vote?
Yes, I'm having a lot of confusion following this.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres votes no. Mr. Perlmutter.
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross votes no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole votes aye. Mr. Burgess.
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Rechenthaler.
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler votes aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Oh, she's there.
Yeah,
You're muted.
It's the miracle.
yeah.
Oh, I am muted.
Now,
Good night.
now you're not.
Okay.
Mrs. Fishbach votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Member does not agree to further amendments. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 39 to Senate Amendment to H.R. 5376, offered by Mr. Murphy of North Carolina. This amendment strikes the pass-through loss limitation and replaces it with a one-year extension of the limitation on deductions for state and local taxes, SALT as it's commonly known. Mr. Chairman, more than 4.7 million businesses are organized as pass-throughs, employing nearly half of America's workforce. Last weekend, the Senate agreed on a bipartisan basis to make changes to the corporate minimum tax and pay for it with an extension of the limitation on deductions for SALT, a provision that disproportionately goes to the wealthiest American. But Senate Democrats couldn't accept this and substituted this pay for with what exists in the bill before us today, a tax on millions of Main Street American businesses. Mr. Murphy's amendment would just go back to the Senate bipartisan vote and not protect millionaires and billionaires at the expense of small mom and pop stores across the country. So with that, Mr. Chair, I urge the adoption of my motion. I yield back.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no.
No.
No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
On that, I'd request recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli, no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess.
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rechenthaler.
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order, amendment number 44 to the Senate Amendment to H.R. 5376. This is offered by Mr. Guthrie of Kentucky. The amendment prohibits the Health and Human Services Secretary from negotiating prices if negotiating drug prices if the Congressional Budget Office determines these negotiations would lead to 10 fewer cures coming to market. As we've already noted, we're running without a proper CBO score, so it's difficult to anticipate the true economic impact that this legislation could have. But we should all agree that negotiating the price of drugs should not be prioritized over finding cures that could save lives. The CBO and the University of Chicago have both found that hundreds of cures will not come to market under the legislation before us today. And we really have no idea what the cures would be for, perhaps Alzheimer's or cancer or other diseases. But it is wrong to proceed without this type of limitation. So I move the amendment be made in order.
And let me just say that I think limiting negotiations gives pharma free rein to keep prices high on drugs that are already very, very, very expensive. This bill delivers on the promise of cheaper prescription drugs, and I oppose any effort to weaken the drug price negotiations provisions included in this bill. And so with that,
Mr. Chairman, I'd just add the further observation, since none of this kicks in till 2026, we probably do have time to evaluate it.
I think I would, again, I know that there are those who are hell-bent on trying to weaken the section on.
How could you make it any weaker? I'm sorry.
Well, the Senate did by getting rid of the $35 cap on, the Senate Republicans did by getting rid of the $35 cap on insulin for those with private insurance. I hope they can live with themselves, but at least we kept that in place for those on Medicare. So the vote now is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes.
No.
That's for the ayes and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr.
Morelli's
Mor-
no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Unmute.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Okay.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Burgess.
I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 57 to the Senate amendment of H.R. 5376, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia. This amendment eliminates Section 6103 of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which would have established a $27 billion program at the EPA for the purpose of funding a national climate bank to finance greenhouse gas reduction programs. One of the biggest concerns of this legislation is the fact that a number of funds appropriated really amount to nothing more than a slush fund. This is going to be used to fund pet projects that will continue to raise already skyrocketing energy costs while everyday Americans are left to foot the bill. It's unfortunate my Democratic colleagues, despite their policies that have led to historic levels of inflation, continue to put their interests above that of the American people. I urge adoption of this motion for the sake of the country, and I yield back.
And for the sake of the country, I'm going to urge that people oppose this amendment because, I mean, maybe, I mean, climate change is real. And I just visited a number of farms in my district where the number one issue that farmers raised to me was climate change. We're having a terrible drought in Massachusetts, invasive species that are threatening crops that didn't exist only a few years ago. We produce maple syrup in Massachusetts, and maple syrup farmers are wondering whether or not they'll be able to continue to have a future because the seasons get shorter and shorter. So, I mean, we just have a difference of opinion on whether this is a priority or not, but in any event, the vote is now on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
And we'll ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morello, no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 36 to the Senate amendment of H.R. 5376. This was offered by Mr. Murphy of North Carolina. This amendment protects patient access to current and future treatment for a range of serious conditions such as Alzheimer's, HIV/AIDS, Parkinson's, and sickle cell disease, amongst others. This amendment takes the $80 billion for the Internal Revenue Service and instead uses the funding to exempt FDA-designated breakthrough therapies of life-saving cures from government price setting. Ultimately, this amendment protects patients, protects their access to current and future treatments for a range of serious conditions, a dignity that these suffering patients deserve. I urge adoption of the amendment.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
And I'll ask for a recorded.
Recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Unmute.
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Hearing none.
Mr. Chairman?
Who's that? Oh, Mr. Rechenthaler.
Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
Rechenthaler.
How can I miss
Thank
you?
you.
Yeah.
I don't know, Mr. Chairman, but I appreciate you recognizing me. I have an amendment, one of 3 that I have. The first amendment is the first one I make in order is number 52 to the Senate Amendment H.R. 5376, offered by my good friend, Mrs. Miller of West Virginia. This amendment prohibits tax credits for electric vehicles produced by or containing components produced by slave or child labor. Specifically, the amendment prohibits the disbursement of the Clean Vehicle Credit, a tax credit subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars. Mr. Chairman, the average cost of an electric car is over $62,000, making it a luxury available only to the wealthiest Americans. The cobalt in lithium-ion batteries that power everyday electronics, including electric cars, often come from countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which employs child slave labor to mine these resources. Knowing this, it's unfortunate that the Democratic majority is providing subsidies to wealthy Americans while exploiting child and slave labor and leaving taxpayers to foot the bill. Certainly, this amendment to strike these subsidies deserves an opportunity for the floor to be debated on the floor and a vote on the floor as well. I urge adoption of my motion. I yield back.
Well, thank you. You heard the amendment from the gentleman. Any?
I have a question. I have a question for the gentleman on
Mr.
his
Perlmutter.
amendment. the gentleman brought up cobalt. I thought that was the program that we're trying to get rid of because it's antique by the IRS, and I yield back.
Thank you very much for your comment. Let me just say one thing about forced labor. And as somebody who authored the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, I take this issue very, very seriously. And I'm proud of the domestic sourcing requirements and support for American manufacturing in this bill. It will create over 1 million new jobs and help secure the supply chain for many products. I'm also proud of the work that this Congress has done in combating forced labor in China, that we've done on a bipartisan basis. We need to, as I said before, any changes to this bill means it goes back to the Senate, and it could cause it to lose privilege, quite frankly. And then we need 60 votes. You need 60 votes to have coffee in the Senate, never mind pass legislation. So we need to send this bill to the President's desk without delay so we can lower costs for hardworking American families. And so I would urge a no vote. The vote now is on the Rechenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I'd request a recorded vote.
The gentleman wants a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross?
I'll deal with it.
No.
I'll
Mr. Neguse?
Just switch it.
Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Rechenthaler.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the roll to make an order amendment number 47 to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5376, which was offered by Ms. Bobert of Colorado. This amendment strikes section 30001 of the bill, which appropriates $500 million to the Defense Production Act Fund to be used for climate initiatives. Mr. Chairman, just last month, the House passed the NDAA by a vote of 329 to 101. This signaled overwhelming bipartisan support and a House consensus on national defense priorities. For this reason, it's incredibly frustrating to see this bill, the provision in this bill before us, that's used to fund highly partisan Green New Deal pet projects in the name of national defense. The Democratic majority should not hamstring our ability to respond rapidly to national security threats. But this legislation does just that by creating yet another climate slush fund. Ultimately, whether you agree or not, this amendment deserves an opportunity for full debate on the House floor. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I would urge a no vote on this. I think Ms. Bobert offered 80 amendments to try to weaken more than 80 amendments to try to weaken the climate section of this bill. We have a very strong difference of opinion as to whether climate change is an issue of national concern, international concern. I don't think she does, but in any event, I would urge a no vote on this amendment. The vote now is on the Rechenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
No.
In opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I'd request the yeas and nays.
The ayes and nays have been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres?
Torres, no.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
Proudly, no.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
Back. And the goose votes no.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Mr. Rechenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my last amendment. I have an amendment to the rule. I move this committee make an order amendment number 41 to the Senate amendment to HR 5376 offered by Mr. Davidson of Ohio. This amendment requires all newly hired IRS auditors to be certified public accountants. Mr. Chairman, this bill allows the IRS to hire 87,000 new agents to go after regular American families, farmers, and small business owners. Americans at every income level will see audit rates rise, with nearly half of all audits occurring on Americans making $75,000 a year or less. If the Democratic majority wants to squeeze as much money out of everyday Americans as possible, we should at least ensure that these new agents are qualified for their job. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Texas.
yeah, this is an extremely important point that the gentleman from Pennsylvania brings up. And, you know, the big accounting firms right now are having difficulty staffing their positions. Whether this number is 87,000 new IRS agents, as we've heard discussed, or a smaller number, there is still going to be a significant strain placed upon this workforce. Now, look, there are already, 70,000 IRS agents that are currently employed? If you add even 20,000 to that number, it becomes one of the largest federal agencies in the country. But my bigger concern is if you don't have people who are properly trained to take on this type of activity, you're going to get basically tax technicians. And tax technicians may not be capable of doing the type of work that they may be doing, and they could be quite injurious to citizens who have to undergo this process. I've been through an IRS audit before. I know how intrusive it is. We need to be very, very careful about what we're setting out to do here, and it just doesn't look like we've done that with enough care. So I think Mr. Rechenthaler's amendment to ensure that everyone that is now credentialed as a newly minted IRS agent, in fact, at least have the CPA credential to their name. So I thank you for bringing this amendment. It's extremely important, and we should consider it.
Well, I urge a no vote on this amendment for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which will derail this bill that will lower prescription drug prices for senior citizens, that will pay down our debt, that will combat climate change, that will lower health care prices for everybody. But I have an idea. So as you know, Dr. Burgess, I normally host cabinet officials and agency heads in my office in a bipartisan way, so we can ask them questions about whatever we want to do. So I'm willing to invite the Trump-appointed IRS commissioner to come to the office so we can have a conversation about whether or not we're concerned about him hiring unqualified people to work in the IRS. And if the answer is he's going to hire people who failed math or who are not qualified, then I'll work with you to try to remedy that. But the bottom line is the head of the IRS is somebody that Donald Trump appointed. And the deal is, and I don't know about your constituents, but I mean, I have constituents that are still waiting for refunds, and they depend on those refunds because they're struggling to make ends meet. We also know that the IRS's IT is totally ancient, that needs to be addressed. And we also know that there are people in this country, wealthy, very wealthy people and rich corporations that get away with dodging paying their fair share because they can. They basically get away with it with impunity. And so, you know, I'm going to give the Trump-appointed IRS commissioner the benefit of the doubt. I'll happy to call a meeting here, and we could all sit down and talk with him about your concerns.
I think that's an excellent idea. It's a little bit after the fact because this type of work should have been done prior to the legislation being written.
I'm sure it has been, but I mean, but the committees of jurisdiction that could answer those questions in more detail are no longer here. But I'm happy to do that. And again, you know, look, this there's a concerted effort here to try to scare people into not voting for this bill, or the American people into not to look away from the benefits that they will get from passage of this legislation. So I will urge a no vote, and I will urge that we pass Mr. Perlmutter's motion, bring it to the floor, make history by passing in the House and getting to the President's desk and helping people.
This is the Rechenthaler.
Oh, the Rechenthaler, so the Rechenthaler, yeah, this is the Rechenthaler stuff, but once we defeat this, we go to Perlmutter and, right, yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting me. All right, so now the vote is on the Rechenthaler amendment. All those in favor can say aye.
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 All those opposed, no. No.
No.
I think the noes have it. Do you want to
Well,
vote?
Mr. Chairman, on that, just to make sure, just to make sure,
Yeah,
out of an abundance of caution.
the clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
I just had a question for the chair. Who's the head of the IRS? I vote no.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
I think he was appointed by Trump, but I would vote no.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Rechenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Rechenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Is there anybody else want to offer an amendment? Hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered from the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. All those in favor will say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Mr. Cole, a recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres?
Aye.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes aye.
Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin? Aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is aye.
Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross? Aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse? Aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Rechenthaler?
No.
Mr. Rechenthaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach?
No.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and I will carry it for the Democrats.
And Mr. Burgess will.
Mr. Burgess, Republicans. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. And we will be on the floor on Friday at 9 o'clock. No 1 minute on Friday, so 9 o'clock sharp on Friday. Thank you all very much. This concludes the hearing. Rules Committee is adjourned.